let's turn to foreign policy. And the thing is, in the mid-1970s, the failure in Vietnam is still fresh in people's mind. The domestic problems with the economy and other issues are weighing on people's conscience. And as a result, people don't have the political resolve to really deal with foreign issues. There are problems in Central America. For example, in Nicaragua, there's a group known as the Sandinistas. And they throw out the dictator that was in charge of Nicaragua and they take over the government. However, they make Nicaragua become more of a socialist economy. And they start to develop ties with communist Cuba. We don't like this. But not as much gets done about it because of the lack of political will at this time. In nearby El Salvador, the blue one on this map, socialist rebels are in a conflict with a repressive dictator. Well, we don't like either one of those in the United States. So who do we support? Well, we kind of waffle on that one. First, we give aid to the rebels, telling them that we'd like to see some democratic reforms if they take over. But then we turn around and give aid to the dictator to fight the socialist rebels because we don't want another communist nation in Central America. Carter does have some success in the Middle East. In 1978, he manages to get the Camp David Accords signed between Egypt and Israel. This leads to a 1979 peace treaty between Egypt and Israel. And this is the first recognition of Israel from an Arab nation. This is the first time an Arab nation has said, yes, Israel is a real country that exists and we will work with. This is a major step for Israeli-Arab relations. And that peace treaty gives all of the Sinai Peninsula back to Egypt. However, unfortunately, it doesn't address the Palestinian issue and what to do with those native Arabs that were in Israel when Israel became a Jewish country. In Iran, there had been a long history of American involvement in Iran. In the 1950s, the Shah, or you can think of him as emperor or king of Iran, was being challenged for his rule of Iran by some more democratically minded challengers. The problem was in the 1950s, we liked the Shah because he was opposed to the Soviet Union and he sold us oil for a good price. So we removed that democratic opposition and we kept the Shah in power. Throughout the 1960s and 1970s up through Nixon and other presidents had used the Shah and his control of Iran to keep the Soviet Union out of the Persian Gulf, that oil-rich region of the country. But the people in Iran are very upset with the Shah. He has a repressive government. He doesn't support their rights. And for some people, they feel like he has turned away from Islam and doesn't support religion the way he should. An exiled religious leader named Ayatollah Khomeini leads a fundamentalist Muslim revolt in the late 1970s. The Shah flees. He gets out of the country. He's scared for his life. The revolutionaries want him to come back and stand trial for his crimes against the Iranian people. However, he needs cancer treatment, and he's admitted into the United States for that life-saving cancer treatment. In response, radicals from the movement in Iran storm the U.S. embassy, and they take Americans hostage. And they say this is in part for not only letting the Shah into America, but for this history of American involvement in Iranian politics dating back to the 1950s. That person circled in red there is the current president of Iran, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad. Carter first tries to use diplomacy to get the prisoners freed. Economic pressure is put on Iran to try to get the prisoners out. Special forces are sent in, Green Berets, to try to get the people out, and their helicopter crashes. 8 soldiers are killed, and some of those hostages are held for over a year, and they are released right after Carter leaves office. If you saw the movie Argo, this is what that whole movie is about, how some of those prisoners were saved early on in the hostage crisis, but some of them are going to stay in there for over a year. This whole ordeal, the Iranian hostage crisis, really shows how weak the United States was in the 1970s. All right, let's move on to the Soviet Union. And with the Soviet Union, Nixon saw some limited progress. His big achievement is him and his foreign policy advisor, his Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger, were able to push SALT I through, which is basically a freeze on nuclear missiles. Nixon and Kissinger had proposed for dealing with the Soviet Union that they start to use some more economic incentives for political concessions. In other words, if the Soviet Union gives the people in the Soviet Union more political rights, the United States is willing to trade more with them or provide more economic aid. Nixon is proposing this as an alternative to using military force as a threat. However, the United States is very weak in the 1970s, and the Soviet Union is not feeling really pressured by the United States anyway. And as a result, they're cracking down on political dissidents, not giving them more rights, but restricting rights. And they're preventing Russian Jews from leaving the Soviet Union. This leaves many Americans, especially Jewish Americans, asking, why are we working with the Soviet Union? Sounds like their beliefs on government are the exact opposite of ours. President Carter, when he's elected, makes human rights an issue in his inaugural address. He talks about human rights worldwide in other parts of the globe, and some see this as a threat to the Soviet Union. Early on in his presidency, he greets Russian exiles at the White House. Again, possibly another shot at the Russians. Carter signs SALT II, which is further restrictions on nuclear weapons. However, Congress never ratifies it. Rather, Congress approves new missiles and spending on new missiles. And it approves spending on new missile-firing submarines. And this really signals a resumption of that Cold War arms race between the United States and the Soviet Union. Carter then exchanges ambassadors with China. We hadn't done this. Remember, we were still arguing that Taiwan was the real China. But Carter's going to exchange ambassadors with communist China. And this is seen as a threat to the Soviet Union because China and the Soviet Union are not really allies by the 1970s. They are rivals to each other. So this is seen as a threat and escalates tension with the Soviet Union. We're getting close. We're moving away from that period of détente where tensions were reduced. And détente officially dies in 1979 when the Soviet Union invades Afghanistan to try to install a communist-friendly government. It looks like the Soviet Union is trying to push towards and get closer to the Persian Gulf to get access to that oil-rich portion of the nation. This leads to Carter issuing what's known as the Carter Doctrine, where he states that the United States will use military force to defend our interests in the Persian Gulf. And he never commits troops, but we do provide weapons and money to people in Afghanistan to fight the communists. If you've seen Charlie Wilson's War, that's what that movie's about. Carter also bans the sale of high technology to Russia. He stops the export of U.S. grain to Russia. He also resumes draft registration for American males. And finally, we boycott the 1980 Olympics in Moscow. And officially, the Cold War is back on by 1980.